How you doing, sir?
Do you have your driver's license, registration, proof,
Yes,
and
sir.
insurance?
I do have a CCW on me.
Okay. Do you have a weapon in the vehicle?
Yes, this is my CCW. It's right here.
Where's that?
Right here.
Okay.
Sir, step out of the vehicle now. The man behind the wheel pauses for a second, reaches slowly for his wallet, and calmly says, "I'm a federal agent. My credentials are in my jacket pocket." But instead of de-escalating the situation, one officer immediately responds, "I don't care who you work for. Get out now." Within minutes, that driver, an off-duty black FBI agent on his way home, was face down on the pavement, handcuffed beside his own car, while officers searched the vehicle without a warrant. And according to the federal lawsuit filed months later, the officers allegedly ignored identification, escalated a routine traffic stop into a public detention, and violated clearly established constitutional protections. What started as a minor traffic stop quickly became a national conversation about race, police discretion, and the difference between lawful authority and abuse of power. And the biggest question in the entire case was this: did officers genuinely believe they were dealing with a threat, or did they stop listening the moment they saw a black man behind the wheel of an expensive vehicle? The man at the center of the case was Marcus Reed, a 42-year-old FBI special agent with more than a decade in federal law enforcement. If knowing your rights matters to you, subscribe now. Share this with someone who needs it, and drop your opinion below. Colleagues described him as quiet, disciplined, and highly respected. He had worked organized crime investigations, gang intelligence, and multi-agency task force operations. By all accounts, he understood police procedure better than most civilians ever would. On the night of the incident, Reed had just finished a late shift and was driving home through a suburban area outside the city limits. According to reports later included in court filings, he was driving a newer black SUV when local patrol officers initiated a traffic stop for what they described as failure to maintain lane and suspicious vehicle behavior. At first, Reed reportedly believed it would be a normal encounter. He slowed down immediately, turned on his interior lights, placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, and waited. Body cam footage later released to the public showed the first officer approaching cautiously, while another unit parked behind him moments later. License and registration. Yes, officer. Before I reach, I want to inform you I'm federally commissioned to law enforcement. Keep your hands where I can see them. Now, at this point, nothing had physically escalated yet, but the tone of the encounter changed almost instantly. The officers later claimed Reed appeared nervous and hesitant. Reed would later argue in court that he was being extremely careful specifically because he understood how quickly armed encounters can go wrong. And that distinction matters, because within less than 2 minutes, the stop went from routine to confrontational. One officer asked Reed why he was armed. Reed responded calmly that he was authorized to carry as a federal agent and that his credentials were in his jacket. But here's where things changed. Instead of allowing Reed to slowly retrieve identification, officers reportedly began issuing overlapping commands. Don't reach. Well, how am I supposed to get my ID? Keep your hands up. My credentials are in the pocket. Step out of the car now. The confusion escalated fast. Body cam footage showed flashlights moving aggressively inside the cabin, while another officer appeared to grip his firearm. Reed exited the vehicle slowly, with his hands visible, but seconds later, officers moved to detain him physically. Turn around. What am I being detained for? Turn around now. I'm complying. One officer then allegedly forced Reed against the side of the SUV, while another removed the firearm from his waistband. Now, the officers later defended their actions by saying they did not yet know whether the credentials were legitimate and that any armed traffic stop carries significant risk. And to be fair, courts generally do give officers broad discretion during potentially dangerous encounters involving weapons. But according to the lawsuit, the situation escalated even after Reed's FBI identification was visually confirmed. That became one of the most controversial parts of the entire case, because multiple minutes passed after officers reportedly knew he was federal law enforcement, yet the detention continued. Body cam footage allegedly showed Reed repeatedly asking a simple question: "Am I under arrest?" And officers repeatedly avoided answering. Then came the vehicle search. One officer opened the rear passenger door. Another began checking compartments, and Reed, still handcuffed on the curb, reportedly asked whether they had consent or probable cause. No direct answer came. Now, this is important. A traffic stop is legally considered a temporary detention under the Fourth Amendment. Generally, officers need reasonable suspicion to initiate that stop. A moving violation, even something minor, can often justify the initial detention. But the legal question changes once the stop expands beyond its original purpose. Courts often look at whether officers had specific, articulable facts suggesting danger or criminal activity beyond the traffic violation itself. And when firearms are involved, things become more complicated. In many jurisdictions, officers are permitted to temporarily secure a weapon during a stop for safety reasons. Courts have frequently recognized officer safety concerns during roadside encounters. But temporary weapon control does not automatically justify prolonged detention, handcuffing, or a warrantless search. At this point, a court might ask several key questions. Did officers reasonably believe Reed posed an immediate threat? Did his behavior justify escalation? And once his credentials were confirmed, did the justification for continued detention disappear? Because generally speaking, a lawful stop cannot become an open-ended fishing expedition without additional probable cause. And this is where officer discretion matters. Two officers can encounter the exact same situation and handle it completely differently. One may calmly verify identification and end the stop in minutes. Another may escalate based on fear, assumptions, or communication breakdown. The Constitution does give officers authority, but it also places limits on how far that authority can go. According to the complaint, the encounter escalated even further after supervisors arrived on scene. Reed remained handcuffed near the curb, while officers discussed whether federal credentials could be verified through dispatch. At one point, one supervisor allegedly questioned why Reed had informed officers he was armed too early, a statement critics later called absurd, given that many law enforcement agencies specifically encourage armed individuals to disclose weapons immediately. Then came another tense exchange captured on body cam. "You people always want special treatment." What does that mean? "You heard me." That single line became explosive online once footage was released, because the lawsuit argued that the tension was no longer about safety. It had become personal. Officers allegedly searched bags inside the SUV, opened containers, and continued questioning Reed despite no evidence of intoxication, contraband, or criminal activity emerging during the stop. Eventually, nearly 40 minutes after the initial detention began, Reed was transported briefly to a local precinct for further verification. No criminal charges were filed, no illegal weapon was found, no narcotics were discovered, no warrants existed. And according to court records, Reed was released without citation later that same night. But by then, the damage had already been done. Because the story didn't stay local for long, civil rights organizations picked it up. Former law enforcement officials weighed in publicly. Retired officers appeared on news panels sharply divided over whether the responding officers acted reasonably or recklessly. And once the body cam footage surfaced, public opinion became even more intense. At this point, the deeper legal issue becomes the vehicle search itself. Under the Fourth Amendment, warrantless vehicle searches can sometimes be lawful under specific exceptions. For example, probable cause involving contraband may justify a vehicle search. An inventory search may occur after lawful impoundment. Protective sweeps for weapons may also be temporarily allowed if officers reasonably believe a dangerous weapon is accessible. But courts generally require those searches to remain limited in scope and tied to legitimate safety concerns. The controversy here was that Reed was already handcuffed and separated from the vehicle when portions of the search occurred. Critics argued that once officers secured both the firearm and the driver, the immediate safety justification weakened substantially. Supporters of the officers countered that roadside uncertainty can evolve quickly, and officers should not be forced to take unnecessary risks. And that's the tension courts often struggle with in cases like this. How much uncertainty is enough to justify escalation? How long can officer safety concerns legally continue? And when does caution become overreach? Another issue raised involved prolonged detention without arrest. Generally, officers cannot extend a stop indefinitely without additional legal justification. A court may examine whether the duration remained reasonably connected to the original investigation. Then there's the question of race. Now, proving racial bias in court is extremely difficult unless there is clear evidence of discriminatory intent. But public perception matters too, because many viewers watching the footage asked the same uncomfortable question. Would this stop have unfolded the same way if the driver had been white and wearing plain clothes with federal credentials? That question became central to the public conversation, even if proving it legally remained complicated. Within months, Reed filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the department and several officers individually. The complaint alleged unlawful detention, unreasonable search and seizure, excessive force, and racial discrimination. The department denied wrongdoing. In an official statement, officials said officers acted within policy and responded appropriately to an armed roadside encounter. But internal affairs investigators reportedly reached a more complicated conclusion. According to later reports, at least 2 officers were disciplined for policy violations related to professionalism and detention procedures. 1 officer was suspended. Another was reportedly reassigned pending retraining. The city eventually faced growing pressure after body cam footage spread online, and national media outlets began covering the case. Former prosecutors noted that even if officers technically had legal authority during parts of the stop, juries often react strongly to encounters that appear unnecessarily aggressive once compliance is obvious. And that distinction matters in civil lawsuits, because conduct can be legally defensible in narrow terms while still appearing unreasonable, excessive, or deeply damaging to public trust. Eventually, according to settlement documents, the city agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement without admitting liability. No officer faced criminal charges, but the department did announce updated training involving armed off-duty law enforcement encounters and de-escalation communication procedures. So, who was right here? The honest answer is that parts of the stop may have started within the boundaries of lawful police authority. An officer pulling over an armed driver at night does face legitimate safety concerns. Courts generally recognize that traffic stops are unpredictable and dangerous. The officers had authority to control the scene initially. They likely had authority to temporarily secure the weapon, and they may have even had grounds for brief detention while verifying identification. But having authority does not automatically mean every decision afterward was wise, ethical, or necessary. Because once Reed complied, once credentials were visible, once no crime indicators emerged, the justification for continued escalation appears much weaker. And this is where accountability becomes essential. Public trust depends on proportionality. People expect officers to assess risk carefully, not escalate indefinitely simply because tension existed at the beginning. At the same time, Reed also appeared to understand something many civilians do not. He stayed calm. He did not physically resist. He did not argue aggressively roadside. He repeatedly asked questions but continued complying. And that likely protected him later on. Because the reality is this: roadside encounters are not controlled environments. Miscommunication, fear, ego, and assumptions can all collide within seconds. But professionalism matters most precisely in those moments, especially when officers encounter someone who is already cooperating. Cases like this remind people why constitutional limits exist in the first place, not to make policing impossible, but to ensure authority stays accountable. If you're ever involved in a police encounter, remaining calm matters. Documenting what happened matters. Asking whether you are free to leave matters. And if questioning becomes serious, requesting legal counsel matters too. The roadside is rarely the place to win an argument. Courts, complaints, evidence, and documentation are where misconduct is challenged. And perhaps the most important lesson from this case is that professionalism cuts both ways. Citizens have responsibilities during encounters, but officers carry enormous power, and that power comes with an equally enormous obligation to use restraint, judgment, and discipline, because once public trust is damaged, rebuilding it becomes far harder than losing it. So, what do you think? Was this lawful police work under tense circumstances, or did these officers take a routine traffic stop way too far?